Hello, hello, hello. This is Dr. Pete Mandick of William Patterson University, and welcome to Introduction to Philosophy. In this video, we're going to do three things. The first one is you're going to take a little time to meet the professor. That's me. And the second and main thing that we're going to be doing is jumping right into introducing philosophy. We're going to be talking about a working definition of philosophy and some of the main topics that philosophy studies and that we'll be covering in this course. And the third part is to talk about some main strategies for success in this course, answering some of the main questions you should be thinking about when you're wondering about, how do you get an A in this course? What is the course going to be graded on? What sorts of things should you be paying attention to and making sure that you're learning? Okay, so meet the professor. This is me and my famous French bulldog, Dave. You can call me Dr. Mandick. I am a doctor of philosophy. I got my PhD in the year 2000. My PhD is from the program in philosophy, neuroscience, and psychology at Washington University. And I have 20 years of experience in higher education, teaching mostly philosophy, but also courses in psychology and in cognitive science. And my interests in teaching and also writing and publishing have to do with the intersection between topics in philosophy and topics in psychology. And I'm very interested in topics about the nature of human consciousness. And some of this stuff will figure into the course. I have published a lot of articles and books, and here are some books that I've published. The most recent is This is Philosophy of Mind, an introduction. And this is a book that covers topics that would be studied in like a junior or senior level course dedicated to the philosophy of mind. That course is one of my favorite courses to teach. It's a 4,000 level course at William Patterson University, Philosophy of Mind. Other courses that I teach on a regular basis are the 3,000 level course, The Philosophy of Space and Time, which deals with topics in the intersection between philosophy and physics and has stuff to do with about like the nature of time itself, the nature of space. Is space infinite? Is it infinitely divisible? What's the nature of time? Is there really such a thing as time, or is it in some sense something that only exists in your mind? I also teach 1,000 level courses such as this course, the Introduction to Philosophy, and also a course called Philosophy of the Future. And one of the main things that are worth knowing about me, besides that I have a very cute dog, is my email address, and there it is. If you run into any sort of trouble, probably the first thing you should do is think about sending me an email and seeing if I can help you out and answer your questions. So enough about me, let's talk about philosophy. Philosophy is one of my favorite subjects. I love to read about it, and I love to teach it. It's my favorite thing, seriously. And it's a lot of fun. I hope you have fun too. One of the most interesting things about philosophy is trying to figure out what philosophy is. In a lot of ways, philosophy is a very weird topic. You study things like mathematics and literature starting at a very, very young age in grade school, kindergarten even, you have exposure to those topics. But it's very rare that you would have any kind of exposure to philosophy until you get to college. So for many people, philosophy seems kind of strange or weird, and it helps to orient ourselves to start with a definition of philosophy. One thing that you'll see about philosophy is that it's very much about controversies. There's a lot in philosophy that's very unsettled, and that includes even the definition of philosophy. A topic of philosophical debate concerns how you would even define philosophy. Nonetheless, we can make progress by having a kind of a sketch or a working definition of philosophy. I think this is one that will serve us quite well. So when we address the question, how can you define philosophy? What's the definition of the word philosophy? I think one thing that will help us is to think about it like this. Philosophy has a lot to do with reason in a special sort of way that distinguishes it from other sorts of intellectual disciplines that you might study at school, like history or biology or mathematics. Philosophy is specifically a pursuit about what you can know as much as possible based on just reason alone, where we're contrasting reason against, for example, experiment or observation. It's the sort of thing that dominates natural sciences like biology or chemistry. In biology and chemistry, one of the main ways in which we have knowledge of biological organisms or of chemicals and chemical reactions is by conducting careful observations using our senses, performing experiments, which are just attempts to manipulate things so that we could observe what happens. So there's very much an emphasis there on observation. In contrast, philosophy is not about conducting experiments. There are no microscopes or test tubes. Instead, it's about what you could figure out based on reasoning. It's not just about reasoning, though. It's specifically about certain sorts of topics. So it's the pursuit of what can be known through reason alone concerning certain sorts of topics. And what are those topics? They are all topics that we could characterize as being especially fundamental. They're fundamental to all knowledge and all ways of living. This definition of philosophy has two parts, and I'm going to spend a lot of time emphasizing these two different parts. One way we could think about these two different parts is they characterize both the method of philosophy and the topics of philosophy. And I think this is a useful way of thinking in general about different sorts of intellectual disciplines and the ways in which philosophy resembles those disciplines and also differs from those disciplines. We could talk about the method of philosophy as well as the method of other intellectual disciplines, and we could talk about the topics of philosophy as well as the topics of those other intellectual disciplines. So here I've got a chart that lays out several different intellectual disciplines that you have some familiarity with, probably. You may have taken a class in biology already, perhaps at the high school level or at the college level. And if we think about biology, what is biology about? What are the main things that you study, either as a student in biology or as a biology professional, maybe a biologist, a scientist who is a specialist in biology? They are investigating life. They're investigating living organisms. And so the topics of biology all have to do with life. But there's also a method. How do you get knowledge about biological organisms? Well, you perform careful observations. And experimentation is one kind of observation. Another kind of observation, maybe you might remember from high school, is doing a dissection. So you dissect a frog and you write down what you see. Other kinds of observation might involve preparing plant cells or animal cells on a microscopic slide and observing them through a microscope. So biology is a kind of knowledge or pursuit of knowledge. It's about life. Its topic or topics concerns life and living organisms. And the main method of gaining that knowledge is through observation. And this emphasis on observation is something that many sciences have in common, and that's part of what makes them sciences. So take, for example, psychology. Psychology is a science. Psychology relies on observation. There's careful observations, and there's experiments. So that method is something that psychology and biology have in common. But what differentiates psychology and biology is the topics. Biology is concerned with life generally, where psychology is concerned with specifically with behaviors of humans and also in animal psychology, non-human animals. Astronomy is another intellectual discipline, another body of knowledge. People studying astronomy, either as students or as astronomers, scientists that study astronomy. The topics are the motions and behaviors of the stars and planets and other astronomical entities as well, comets and moons. And there, again, knowledge is gained through observation. You might be observing things through telescopes instead of microscopes, but nonetheless, you're gaining knowledge through observation. So the natural sciences have a heavy reliance through a method of observation, and that creates a big contrast with philosophy. So we've got philosophy down here. The method of philosophy is more similar to the method of mathematics than, say, the method of biology, where biology or psychology or astronomy have a heavy emphasis on observation. In math, you gain knowledge through reasoning. You might have a logical proof or you perform some kind of calculation, but you're not performing an observation. You're not conducting an experiment. You don't figure out whether 2 plus 2 equals 4 by putting 2 rabbits in a cage and then another 2 rabbits in a cage and then counting and see what happens later. Because later on you might have way more than 4. Those rabbits might have baby rabbits. That's a biological fact about rabbits. But the mathematical knowledge that we have that, for example, 2 and 2 equal 4, or that the interior angle sum of a triangle always adds up to 180 degrees, that is something that we know based on being able to prove it through a logical method that is a way of basically reasoning. It's reason itself as opposed to looking and observing. Finally, we've got a contrast between all of these disciplines: biology, psychology, astronomy, math, and philosophy, and finally religion, and closely related is theology. Religion, the kind of knowledge that is claimed to be had in religion, is something that's very distinctive, and even though religion and philosophy might have certain things in common, they both concern very fundamental topics like what's the meaning of life, or what's the nature of existence, what if anything happens when you die. These are very fundamental topics. But religion and philosophy are not the same thing, and the way to distinguish philosophy and religion is the emphasis that one puts on reason and the other puts on revelation. In religion, there's a claim that there are certain divine revelations, that some kind of divine reality, God or the gods or some kind of spirit, has revealed itself to mankind. That revelation is transmitted through scriptures or special people, prophets, priests. So we can think about intellectual disciplines both in terms of the topics, what they're about, and the method for gaining knowledge about those topics. And philosophy is one example. One important way of thinking about reasoning, or a way of talking about reasoning, its relationship to knowledge, is something that we can express using this Latin phrase a priori and this related Latin phrase a posteriori. So one thing that you're going to see in this course is that there's a lot of terminology that's specific to philosophy, and here's a bit of terminology that you're going to need to know. We could talk about two different kinds of knowledge in terms of whether it's a priori knowledge versus a posteriori knowledge. A priori is a Latin phrase that maybe reminds you of certain English words like the word prior. And a posteriori is a Latin phrase and it maybe reminds you of the English word posterior, like something that comes after. So we have a contrast here between a priori knowledge and a posteriori knowledge that is roughly a contrast we could put in terms of knowledge that you can have before something versus knowledge that you can have only after something. But what is it that we're talking about when we say before or after? Before what? After what? And the answer to that question is experience, or in other words, observation. So take, for example, these two propositions that I've got on the slide here. Proposition A and Proposition B. Proposition A says, Dave, there's Dave, famous Dave, the French bulldog. Dave either weighs exactly 25 pounds or he doesn't. So there's a proposition, or in other words, there's a sentence. It's a sentence in English. Dave either weighs exactly 25 pounds or he doesn't. And I could ask you, is that sentence true or false? Do you agree with that sentence, or do you disagree with that sentence, or you just have no opinion about that sentence? Well, I think most people will realize that if you think about this sentence for a little bit, you realize this sentence has to be true. Regardless of how much Dave actually weighs, regardless of whether you have weighed Dave yourself, whether you've put him on a scale or talked to anybody who's put him on a scale, you could just think about this sentence and realize this sentence has to be true. It's true that either Dave weighs exactly 25 pounds or he doesn't weigh exactly 25 pounds. Whatever he weighs, it's going to end up falling into one of those categories. So that is something that you can know a priori. You know, prior to any kind of measurement of Dave, prior to weighing Dave, you know that this sentence is true. So that's a priori knowledge. You might say this is knowledge that you can have based on reasoning alone. You don't have to conduct any kind of observation. You don't have to take a measurement of Dave to know that this is true. In contrast, proposition B is a piece of a posteriori knowledge. Dave weighs exactly 25 pounds. You can't know that that's true unless either you have weighed Dave yourself or someone else has weighed Dave and you've got independent reason for believing that you could trust what they tell you. How would you get that independent reason? It would be through some kind of observation. You'd observe this person and observe that they are reliable and in general say things that are true instead of false. But again, that is observation. You can only know that proposition B is true or false, whatever it is, you can only know that after you've conducted some kind of specific observation, an observation that one way or another leads specifically to Dave. But you don't have to have any particular Dave-related observations to know that proposition A is true. So we say that proposition B is an example of a posteriori knowledge. It's knowledge that you can have only after you have a very specific observation related to the topic in question, where in contrast, proposition A is a priori knowledge, knowledge that you can have based on reason alone. Given the relationship between the concept of a priori knowledge and the concept of knowledge based on reasoning alone, we could use the concept of a priori knowledge to give a slightly different definition to philosophy than the definition that we've given already. We could say that in philosophy, we're interested in a certain kind of a priori method. We're not just trying to investigate fundamental topics, but we're trying to investigate those topics by using a kind of a priori method, the kind of method that allows you to have knowledge prior to sensory experience, prior to observation and experiment. So earlier we defined philosophy as the pursuit of what can be known through reason alone concerning topics that are fundamental to all other ways of knowledge fundamental to all other knowledge and ways of living. Now we're defining philosophy as the pursuit of a priori knowledge concerning topics that are fundamental to all other ways of knowledge and living. So we were stating the method of philosophy in terms of an a priori method. The chart that we looked at earlier, we could adjust in terms of this terminology as well. So biology, psychology, astronomy are all methodologically a posteriori. The methods of gaining knowledge in those sciences are a posteriori methods, where philosophy and math have in common a heavy reliance on a priori methods, things like logical proofs, arguments, reasoning, and in contrast to the natural sciences, not so much of an emphasis on experiments or observations. You don't have to perform any experiments in philosophy. There's not a lab component. Same with math. You don't have to dissect anything. You don't have any microscopes or telescopes in the math classroom. Religion ends up being another example of something a posteriori if we think of revelation as a certain kind of experience, maybe even an extrasensory experience. What I'd like to do now is talk about the main topics of philosophy. A lot of what I've been saying for the past few minutes has been emphasizing the method part of the definition of philosophy, but I want to focus on the topics. Philosophy concerns topics that are fundamental to all knowledge and ways of living. And those are topics like the topic of ethics or the topic of knowledge itself. Here's a fundamental topic: reality. What counts as reality? What's the difference between what's real and what isn't real? Other topics that are fundamental to all knowledge and living are topics like God or free will or the mind itself. And finally, we're going to talk about death and the meaning of life. These are all hopefully topics that you recognize as very big topics. They're big picture topics. They have to do with life in general or existence in general, not just a specific kind of knowledge, like the specific kind of knowledge that you would gain if you took a class about accounting or a class on statistics or a class on the history of the Roman Empire. But we're interested in knowledge in general. What is knowledge? So I'd like to spend a little bit more time introducing these topics in order. So starting with ethics and working our way through these main topics, especially the first 6 topics. So the topic of ethics concerns, in general, what's valuable. So one way in which we think about value is in terms of the value of actions. Some actions are actions that you ought to perform. These are right actions versus wrong actions. Some actions you ought to avoid. You shouldn't, unless there's special circumstances, you shouldn't kill anybody. Maybe self-defense is a reasonable excuse for having to take a human life, or maybe it isn't. But that question is a question of ethics. Ethics concerns not just action, but things generally in terms of value. So what things are valuable? People value money, people value life, people value friendship. Is everything valuable in some sense? Are there certain things that are more valuable than other things? Like if you had to choose between a certain amount of money and saving the life of somebody, is there any amount of money that would be more valuable than life? And we could also ask questions like, what values are the most basic values? So you might say that money is valuable, but it's not valuable in and of itself. The value of money is only something that is relative to the sorts of things that you could buy with the money. And the sorts of things that you can buy with the money, those are the things that are truly valuable. So you could use the money to buy a house. You could use the money to buy clothes. That's presumably where the value of money comes from, the things that you could buy with it. But what about the house? Is that intrinsically valuable? Is it valuable in and of itself? And you might say, well, it's not valuable in and of itself. It's only valuable insofar as it could keep me warm. Well, why do you want to stay warm? Well, because if I got cold, I would die. I don't want to die. If I was cold, I would be miserable. I'd be unhappy. I don't want to be unhappy. I don't want to suffer. So you might say that is what's truly valuable, being alive or being happy while you're alive. So these general questions are the questions studied in ethics. Thinking about ethical questions like right and wrong, what makes something right versus wrong, will help us emphasize the nature of philosophy as being an a priori discipline, as being something that is contrasted against the a posteriori. So take, for example, something that is obviously, I hope, obviously to you, it's unethical to drop kick a baby. It's unethical to see how far down a football field you can kick a baby. So there's no controversy about that. Kicking babies is obviously wrong. But we might wonder, what's wrong about it? How do you know that it's wrong? And it doesn't seem like anything scientific is going to answer that question for you. There's nothing that you could observe about the situation that makes it wrong. All you could observe about the situation, say scientifically, are things about like how much the baby weighs, how fast the baby is flying. These are the sorts of things that we know a posteriori. So an example of a posteriori knowledge is that a drop-kick baby can fly over 50 feet. So that's the sort of thing that you could observe. You can conduct an experiment and see how far you can kick the baby. But no experiment or scientific observation is going to tell you that it's wrong to kick the baby. So how do you know that it's wrong to kick the baby? And how do you know what makes it wrong? And how do you know that, for example, a baby is more valuable than money? Here it looks like our only recourse to figure these sorts of questions out, these sorts of ethical questions, is a priori methodology. So it would be an example of a priori knowledge to state that it is morally wrong to drop-kick a baby. So this example of the drop-kick baby is something that's helping us illustrate not only ethics, one of the main fundamental topics that philosophy studies, but also illustrate what it is about philosophy that is a priori, what it is about philosophy that distinguishes it specifically from the natural sciences. So ethics is the first big or fundamental topic that we're going to be studying in this class. The second is knowledge itself. So we're going to be studying the nature of knowledge. What does it mean to know something? And what are the sources of knowledge? A lot of what I've been saying so far has been about knowledge. The distinction between a priori knowledge and a posteriori knowledge is something that we're going to study a lot more in our unit about knowledge. We're going to study a view called empiricism, which is the view that most knowledge is the sorts of knowledge that you get through sensory experience. A contrasting view that we're going to look at is called rationalism, which emphasizes a priori knowledge. So a lot of what I've been saying so far is actually a little bit controversial because there's a controversy between the empiricists and the rationalists about how much knowledge is a posteriori versus a priori. And then finally, we're going to look at a position called skepticism, which in one way or another rejects claims to knowledge. So the skeptic is someone who says, I don't know, and neither do you. Really broad forms of skepticism might claim that there's no knowledge at all. And there's smaller forms of skepticism, like you might say that you can't know whether God exists or not. But you can know things like whether you've got hands or whether you're wearing your glasses. So there might be different kinds of skeptics. There might be people that are skeptics about global warming, but not skeptics about whether the earth is round. Or there might be people that are skeptics about everything. So we're going to be studying the general question of what knowledge is and some different views about how you get knowledge, what are the main sources of knowledge, and whether there actually is any knowledge. One puzzle that we'll talk about, and philosophy is filled with puzzles, is the puzzle of how do you know that there's anything external to your brain? Most of us think that we have knowledge about things based on what we can see. So I can turn around and look and see that there's a guitar behind me, and I could pluck a string and I can hear the guitar note it's playing a note. And those are examples of things that we know based on our senses. We have sensory experiences. I can see that there's a bottle here and that the bottle has got some water in it. I can taste that it's water. All of our senses are mediated by some kind of sensory organs that connect to our brain. So your vision goes through your eyes, which is connected to your brain, and the things that you taste are messages go from your tongue to your brain. You hear with your ears, and that's connected to your brain too. And in theory, all of that might be replaced instead by a computer. There could be a computer that is hooked up to your brain and putting messages directly into your brain so that it is tricking your brain and providing a virtual reality to the brain. So if it's true that all of your knowledge is based on your senses, and the senses could be fooled by just bypassing the sensory organs like your eyes and going straight to the brain, how do you know that isn't happening right now? How do you know you're not just a brain in a vat who's hooked up to a virtual reality computer that's making it think that it's hearing or seeing things in the external world? Our next fundamental topic that we study in this class is the topic of reality itself. What is the nature of reality? You might say that lots of intellectual disciplines are interested in reality. So, for example, biologists are studying animals and plants, and those things are real. Animals and plants have reality. But in philosophy, we ask questions like, what is reality itself? What is the nature of reality? Is the nature of reality somehow in the mind? Are the things that are real really, in some sense, imaginary? Or is there some important difference between what's real and what's in the mind? Is reality the sort of thing that exists outside of the mind, independent of the mind? What is the nature of the things that exist? Is everything material? Is everything made out of matter? Everything that exists, is it something that could be touched or seen, or does it also include things that are abstract, like numbers? Do numbers have an existence independent of, to take for an example, I hold up 2 or 3 fingers. Does the number 3 exist independently of the 3 fingers? I might take the fingers away. I might erase everywhere that the number 3 is written down which really is, that's the numeral 3, it's not the number. But how about the number itself? Does it exist nonetheless? Doesn't it exist in some kind of abstract way? Other things that get talked about in philosophy under this heading of reality has to do with like the nature of space and time. Everything that we're familiar with is somewhere. It's somewhere in space, and it's somewhen. It happens at some time or other. But what are those things? What is space itself? What is time? Are they infinite? Do they go on infinitely? Is there a beginning to time? And we can ask questions like, do they change? Does time change? And you might say, obviously, time changes. It sometimes it changes fast. Sometimes it goes slowly. Right now, I'm holding my hands up, but time changes, and now I'm not holding my hands up. And you might say, now is changing. There's all sorts of different things happening now, and you wait a little bit, and there's something else happening. But maybe that's an illusion. Maybe time itself doesn't change. Things change, and what it means for things to change is that there's different things located at different moments in time, but maybe time itself is just one big thing that is, in some sense, frozen, and all moments, past, present, and future, are equally real, and there's nothing changing or flowing with respect to time. Another big topic that we're going to dive into is the topic of God. Philosophy concerns things that are fundamental, or in other words, things that are ultimate, and we might wonder about the ultimate nature of reality with respect to whether it comes from something. Is there a creator? Is there a God that created reality? Or instead, is reality godless, as the atheists say? If reality is created, what's the nature of the creator? Is the creator good? And how good is the creator? Is the creator infinitely good? Now, a lot of the topics that are connected to the topic of God, topics like why do innocents suffer? Is it possible for something to come out of nothing? Are also topics that are studied within religion or theology. And a lot of the study within religion or theology takes for granted that there's certain things that have been revealed by God. Depending on what religion you are, you might hold certain documents as holy scripture, while you reject others as being the mistaken beliefs of some other religion than the one you belong to. But in philosophy, we try as much as possible to discuss these things from the perspective of what reason alone tells us. So we don't accept, for the purposes of philosophical investigation, that any scripture is true. We try to figure out what we can figure out based on reason. So based on reason alone, could you, for example, prove that God doesn't exist, that God couldn't exist? Or instead, could you use reason to prove that God has to exist? And you could also investigate hypothetical questions, like, for example, if God existed, would it follow that there is no suffering? Or instead, is it possible for God to exist and nonetheless there are a bunch of people that are unhappy? We'll talk about this a little bit later in this video. Another big topic that we're going to study is the topic of free will. A lot of our discussions concerning ethics, one of the big topics that we're going to start with, might be put in terms of moral responsibility. Under what conditions are you morally responsible? And that's closely related to this idea of what you can do freely, what you can do as a matter of your own free will. If you are blamed for doing something that's immoral or unethical, arguably that presumes that it was under your free will to do that thing or to avoid that thing. If, in contrast, you couldn't help but do it, if we could prove that the reason that you ran that person over in your car is that you had a brain tumor that made you do it, we might let you off. We might say, well, we can't blame you for that. You couldn't help it. It was beyond your free will. It was something that you had no choice in. So sometimes in discussions about ethics or morality, we will invoke someone's free will. We'll talk about moral responsibility in terms of what people were able to do freely. But that raises the question of whether there is such a thing as free will. From a scientific perspective, maybe everything that happens is caused by some prior event. If we look at this picture, we've got a representation of some dominoes. One of the dominoes has been knocked over. And we're familiar in general with cause and effect, and we understand that this domino is falling, and it's going to cause this domino to fall, and it's going to cause these other dominoes to fall. And we can ask the question of why this domino is falling, and we can see that there's some prior event, some finger pushed the domino. So in all of these examples of cause and effect, there's this one event that is caused by some prior event. Now this hand is attached to an arm, and you can kind of see that there's a person here, and the person also kind of looks like a machine, or they're connected to a machine. And this is illustrating a certain kind of scientific view of people, that maybe people are just machines. Your bones and the joints between them are just like the joints in a robot arm or the joints in a machine. The muscles are like a kind of motor that makes things happen. The nerves are like wires. The brain is like a computer. From a scientific perspective, we could ask why the finger moved, and the finger moved because the muscles contracted, and we could ask why the muscles contracted, and they contracted because the nerve impulses stimulated them, and we could ask why the nerve impulses stimulated them, and we could trace it back to activity in the brain. We could ask about the activity in the brain. Why is the brain acting that way versus the other way? And there we could trace it to sensory information that goes into the brain. We could trace it to the DNA that helped the brain grow from a little baby. And where did the baby come from? We understand that the baby came from a sperm and an egg that were fertilized and gave rise to a fetus that was born as a baby and grew into an adult. We appreciate that the brain is made out of molecules, and the ways in which the molecules are behaving were governed by the laws of nature and cause and effect that we could trace all the way back to before this person was even born. There were all sorts of forces that brought about this brain and made this brain act in a certain way. Prior to this person even being born, this whole event was set in motion, and we might say this whole event was predetermined. But now that makes it seem like maybe there is no free will. If everything is predetermined, then everything that you do was actually meant to happen. It was caused to happen by prior events. Everything that you do is some combination of the influence of your genes, your DNA, plus the influence of society, the way that your environment, that includes people and other things, has influenced your senses and stored in your memories. But all of that is just really influences on your brain, which is a mechanical system, and is just as deterministic as dominoes whacking into each other, knocking each other down. So maybe everything that you do is just predetermined, and you don't actually have free will. You just think you have free will. The topic of free will is closely related to the topic of mind. When we study the mind in philosophy, we're interested in questions like, for example, whether your mind is the same thing as your brain. Is the mind and the brain really just two different ways of talking about one and the same thing? Or are we dealing with two separate things here? Is it possible that your mind is more like what people have called a soul? Is it possible that you could have a fully functioning brain and your mind leaves it? Is it possible that your brain could be destroyed and your mind survives that destruction and maybe lives on to go to heaven or hell, or to be reincarnated in a different body with a different brain? This general question is known as the mind-body problem. What's the relationship between your mind and physical bodies, physical objects like your brain? One big position in this debate is known as dualism, which holds that the mind and physical bodies are two completely kinds of thing, that your mind is distinct from your brain. The contrasting view that we'll study is known as physicalism, which holds that your mind and your brain are the same thing. Your mind is just physical. And that has implications for all sorts of other things that we're going to study, like, for example, the earlier topic of free will, or questions about whether you could ever know that you're a brain in a vat or not. Towards the end, we're going to discuss things like death. From a philosophical point of view, what is death? What does it mean to survive versus to die? And what is the meaning of all of this? In philosophy, we look at the big picture, and one of the big things that we have to talk about is whether there's anything worth calling the meaning of life. Is existence ultimately meaningless? Are we just a bunch of atoms, collections of atoms whizzing around through space and time? Or are we just animals that are acting on their instincts and interacting with each other, and eventually we're all going to go extinct? Or is there some point to it all? And is there a meaning that can be given to existence itself? And how does one lead a meaningful life? What I'd like to do in this video and in the other videos is to give you some sample multiple choice questions. One of the things that you're going to be graded on in this course is your performance on certain quizzes that are all multiple choice and true and or true false. And some of the questions that are going to be on the quizzes are going to literally be questions that are right in the videos. So you get a little chance to practice and know what's coming. So I'll present some study questions for you. You might want to pause the video so you could write them down, or just pause the video and think about them. A little bit later in the video, I'll give the answers. And here we go. So study question number 1. Which of the following best fills in the blank in the following sentence? And here's the sentence. Both mathematics and philosophy seek blank knowledge, which is knowledge based more on reason alone than on sensory experience or observation. So we've got 5 choices here, A through E. So what fills in this blank? Is it A, absolute, B, inductive, C, pragmatic, D, a posteriori, or E, a priori? So that's the first of 3 study questions for this video. Study question 2 is true or false. So, true or false? Although they both deal with fundamental topics such as the existence of God, ethics, and the meaning of life, the main difference between philosophy and religion concerns how much one of them relies on claims of divine revelation and authority. So, A, if it's true, or B, if it's false. What do you think? Is that true or false? Another true-false question for question number 3. True or false? Although they both seek knowledge based more on reason alone than on sensory experience or observation, the main difference between philosophy and mathematics concerns how much one of them focuses on topics fundamental to all forms of knowledge and living, such as free will, right and wrong, and the definitions of knowledge and reality themselves. Is that true? If so, you would write down A or select A. Otherwise, if it's false, you would pick B. Now, you should know the answers to those questions just based on watching this video. Some of the questions that will be on the quizzes are about the readings, but these study questions here, if you understood what was presented in the video previous, you should be able to know the answers to these questions. I will supply the answers a little bit later in the video, but what I want to do now is focus on the third part of what's scheduled for this video, Part 3, Strategies for Success in this course. Now, there's probably a lot that you need to know for any course, and it's oversimplified to say that you just need to know these 4 things. Nonetheless, in a lot of ways, these 4 things can get you pretty far. So if you're wondering, especially later on in the semester, maybe you're feeling a little bit lost, you're feeling a little bit insecure about whether you're doing well or not, you can ask yourself, well, are you doing these 4 things? Have you kept in mind these 4 strategies for success? So I'm going to talk about these in a lot more detail, but the first has to do with the syllabus and email. So if you have any questions, you should read the syllabus first and see if the syllabus answers those questions. And then send me an email if you can't find the answer in the syllabus. The second strategy for success is what your grade is based on. A lot of people in a lot of different classes maybe aren't sure what they're being graded on, and different professors have different things that they're looking for. In this class, your grade is based on how much philosophy you know. So it's not based on how hard you worked. It's not based on if I like you or not. I like everybody, but not everyone gets an A. It's based on how much philosophy you know. That's what your grade's based on. I'm going to say a little bit more later about the relationship between the lectures and the readings and the stuff that you're going to get graded on. And then finally, I want to make a remark about the importance of arguments in this class. This is something that is a big deal for philosophy in general, and it's especially a big deal for this class. So let's start with strategy for success number 1. Syllabus first, then email. A lot of your professors have a syllabus for their class, and they'll tell you to read the syllabus. But when I say it, I really, really mean it. my syllabus is something that I wrote myself. It wasn't written by somebody else. It's something that I take very seriously. I'm always updating it every year. I'm making sure it's relevant and helpful. And so I ask you to take it seriously also. So if you have any questions or concerns, do look at the syllabus and see if there's somewhere in the syllabus where it spells it out for you. If you're wondering about what happens if work is late, is there a penalty on late work? If you're wondering what happens if you are if you don't know what the assignment is or where you find the assignment, look at the syllabus. And if you look at the syllabus and you still can't find the answer to your question, the best way to get a hold of me is by email. And you can email me at mandicp@wpunj.edu. Oh, I left out the edu that's supposed to be right there, but you know what? Type it right in. So that's my email address. Send me an email, but only after you've made sure you check the syllabus. The second strategy for success is to keep in mind that the point of this course is for you to learn philosophy, for you to know philosophy. And there's two main ways in which I try to figure out how much philosophy you know. And those two ways is there's going to be quizzes that are based on the sorts of questions that you saw just a little bit ago, multiple choice questions. Sometimes you'll have 5 choices, A, B, C, D, E. Sometimes it'll be 2 choices, true or false. But you're going to have multiple choice quizzes. And then there's going to be written essays. Both of these are ways of seeing how much philosophy that you know. And they test your knowledge of philosophy in slightly different ways. With written essays, I emphasize putting things in your own words. That is a really important way of knowing that you know something, is if you could state it in your own words. And this is why it's important for these assignments that you're not just copying and pasting things. This is why plagiarism is such a big deal, because when you copy things, that doesn't really demonstrate your knowledge very much. Maybe, it slightly shows that you have a good sense of taste if you copy good things versus bad things, but it doesn't really show me that you know philosophy the way it would if you could put it in your own words. And this is why I make such a big deal about plagiarism in my classes. If you get caught for plagiarizing, there's no second chances. So you're going to fail the course. If you have questions about what counts as plagiarism, I have documents that I provide about that. In the syllabus, there's links to the official university policy about plagiarism, what the definition of plagiarism is according to William Patterson University, what the penalties are. It will explain how it's totally within William Patterson policy for the professor to fail you for the entire course. Also, I provide documents to spell out in further detail with examples and stuff about what counts as plagiarism. But the main thing to keep in mind here is how important it is to put things in your own words. If you're able to put philosophical ideas and philosophical arguments in your own words, and the professor recognizes that, oh yes, that is your own words, and yet nonetheless you got the right answer, then that really shows that you understand it. And now we know that you know philosophy, and you'll get a good grade. The third strategy for success concerns what it is that you should be studying as you prepare for your multiple choice quizzes, or if you prepare for your written essays. Students wonder, well, what is it that they're supposed to be paying attention to? What is important? There's a sense in which it's all important, that's why it's here, but nonetheless, some things are more important than other things. And the way I think of my own courses is that the most important material is material that appears both in the lectures and the readings. So if you find something in both of those locations, that is most likely to be on the quiz. The least likely thing to be on the quiz would be something that shows up only in the reading. If it shows up only in the reading, but I don't talk about it all in the lecture, that is not as important as something that shows up in both the lecture and the readings. Now, if it shows up only in the readings, it doesn't mean it's not important at all. The readings aren't filled with garbage. But nonetheless, if you're wondering how to manage your time, what things to emphasize, I would say you should emphasize the things that appear both in the lectures and in the readings. Now, what about things that appear only in the lectures? So there's going to be a lot of stuff that I talk about that isn't in the readings. Well, that's more important than the things that is only in the readings, but I don't talk about it. So one thing that you should get out of this is how important I think the lectures are. Another thing that's important is an emphasis on arguments. Now, you might be familiar with this use of the word argument. It's different from another use of the word argument, where we use the word argument to talk about like a fight, two people fighting or having an argument. But there's another use of the word argument where we use argument to talk about the reasons for something. So if I'm trying to sell my guitar and I explain to someone the reason you should buy this guitar is because it's, it makes a really nice sound. Well, I'm giving them an argument for buying the guitar. If someone tries to convince you that God exists, they might say, well, the reason God exists is because everything had to come from something, and therefore God is the first cause, the thing that made everything else. So they're giving you an argument. A lot of what we're going to study in this class are arguments. These are sets of reasons for various sorts of philosophical views. And one way to think about arguments relative to your studying and your preparation for the quizzes and the essays is that knowing the argument is, in a lot of ways, the most important part of philosophical knowledge. You don't really know a philosophical proposition unless you understand what the argument is for that proposition. Let's take a quick look at an example. This will come up again when we get to our God unit, but let's take a real quick look at the thesis known as atheism, which we could define as the view that God does not exist. And here is an example of an argument. This is a very famous argument in the philosophy of religion. It's an argument against the existence of God. It's sometimes called the argument from evil, although it might be better described as the argument from suffering. And we've got 3 sentences here, and 2 of the sentences are the premises in the argument. These 2 things together count as the reasons for believing the conclusion. The conclusion is that God does not exist. That's, in other words, atheism. We use the word therefore to signal that that's the conclusion. Why is this supposed to be true? Well, this is supposed to follow logically from premise 1 and premise 2. Premise 1 says, if God exists, then no suffering exists. And premise 2 says suffering does exist. And we are invited to conclude then that God does not exist. So there's an example of an argument. And there's a lot more to say about that argument. We could discuss whether it's a good argument or not, whether it's a convincing argument. If premise 1 and premise 2 are true, would that make the conclusion true? Or is there some sense in which the conclusion doesn't really follow from premise 1 and 2? Or we might say, well, actually, if premise 1 and 2 were true, then the conclusion would follow, but nonetheless, one of these premises is false. Well, which one is it, if so? Is it false that if God exists, then no suffering exists? And we'll get into further arguments there. Someone might argue that just because God exists, it doesn't mean that there wouldn't be any suffering. Maybe the existence of God means that God created people to have free will, and they use their free will to bring about the suffering of others. And that's why there's suffering in the world, even though God exists. And other people might say, no, that doesn't make sense. If God existed, God would be all-loving, and he wouldn't want anybody to suffer, and he'd be all-powerful, and he'd be able to prevent that suffering. And so therefore, if an all-loving, all-powerful God existed, he would have created a world that had absolutely no suffering in it. This is something, whether this is a good argument or not, and what are some of the counter-arguments, is something that we'll discuss in a lot more detail later on in the course, but I wanted to present it as an example of an argument and the importance of arguments. So we had this earlier strategy for success, strategy number 4, which we could state as saying that you don't really truly understand a philosophical proposition unless you know the arguments for that proposition. And so here's a philosophical proposition, atheism, the view that God does not exist. Well, what are some arguments for that view? You don't really understand this unless you understand some reasons that people have given for believing in that. And one of the famous ones, one of the ones you'll need to know for this course, is the argument from evil. Okay, so there are 4 strategies for success. I think that if you pay close attention to strategies 1 through 4. Keep those close in mind. You'll probably do pretty well in this class. And if at any point you feel like you're not doing so well in the class, well, keep in mind strategy number 1, and send me an email. If there's any problems, let's try to figure them out as soon as we can. I'm here to help you. Okay, here are the answers for the study questions. The answer to question number 1 was E, number 2 was A, and number 3 was also A. And that brings us to the end of lecture number 1. This has been Dr. Mandic, and I will see you at lecture number 2. Thank you.